Howdy, all you delicious people. I am here today to review the 2014 movie Wolves. So, with this movie, we end up having it to where it seems that we end up having Lucas Till, who is a guy by the name of Caden. It seems that everything is going quite well for Caden. It seems like he's eventually going to have the perfect girl, the perfect life, the perfect family, ba 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 ba. And the only thing that Caden really is to really have problems with is nightmares, and from time to time turning into a werewolf. Eventually, we end up having Caden, who, for one reason or another, let's keep this cryptic, eventually gets torn away from his life, gets completely and utterly uh, thrown from his life of being with this perfect world to eventually push out of this perfect world to eventually go and just be a drifter to try and thumb it from town to town to eventually try and find some kind of connection somewhere, some kind of belonging somewhere. And eventually, when Kanan is to go from bar to bar to bar, he eventually ends up finding a person that is quite like him to head him into a location to help him find uh, other people like him or people who can help him get answers to what he needs to do. I thought that this movie was kind of interesting, but it just kind of feels very like story wise just kind of very small. We end up having this being like when eventually this whole entire thing is laid out, it just feels like man, this like it doesn't feel like there's enough real like story part here. But really when going into this film, we just kind of go like, well yeah, but like did you enjoy the ride? I sure as heck did. Plus, we also have to our seemingly Caden is to be going along with a girl in this movie to eventually have some werewolf passionate lovemaking. So I guess we could just have a good thumbs up about that in this movie. So with that said, yeah, I think that's all that I really have to say about this movie in a very cryptic like sense. Very good effects to me, and very good way of approaching this film because I love good old fashioned guy in a suit. I really hate a CGI'd werewolf or just an overly CGI'd movie, which it seems the most point that they try to keep that to a minimum. I actually was won over by this film. Just because like men in a suit, and plus also, um, I kind of like the way of which this story goes, even though the story feels fairly small. So yeah, I think that's all that I had to say about this film. Because eventually I want to save something for the cryptic talk of this because there isn't much story wise for me to talk in a cryptic sense about this film. So fairly decent werewolf movie. I could say that this like starts out to kind of feel um, almost a little bit like Teen Wolf in some capacity. I think maybe much more the show than the Michael J. Fox or the Jason Bateman movie or whatever. If I even said that right. But yeah, so going into here, I think it's about that coveted time yet again to do that double count and do that arm waving. Spoiler time, spoiler time. It's about that time I'm going to spoil this movie. So, like I said, we end up having Jaden, who seems to have a perfect life in the beginning of this film. We end up having Caden, who is to be on the football team, and it seems that we end up having Caden, who seems to be having nightmares at night, where we eventually have his mother to come in and try to comfort him. we end up having Caden, who is eventually going on to the football field, and eventually it seems that there is one guy that ends up getting into Caden's face, and we end up eventually having Caden, who ends up going and continues to punch um, another football player in the head, to where the helmet part of his freaking head just gets caved in, and we are to assess or assume that this guy is dead. This guy is straight up dead. And so we end up having it to where it seems that eventually Caden is, I'm assessing or assuming, going to get suspended from school and whichever. And so we end up eventually having Caden, who is to go home and try to sleep all this off, to eventually wake up to realize that he had killed his parents. So we end up having Caden decide, like, dude, I'm peacing out after this. Uh, because we end up having Caden, who was to also try and make some lovin' with his girlfriend. He ends up trying to passionately make out with his girlfriend, and while he's doing that, we end up having Caden slowly start to turn to a werewolf during that time, and we end up having his girlfriend reject him and call him a monster. To eventually we end up having Caden, who ends up going home to go and just slaughter his family or wake up with his family dead. And so we end up having Caden decide to run away because people are calling him a monster. And so we end up having Caden, who ends up going and thumbing it from town to town to try and figure out how to uh, do something with this werewolf thing. We end up having two guys go on to attack attack some woman, and we end up having Caden, who ends up coming to her evade, or to come to her like protection. And so we end up having Caden, who ends up turning into this werewolf, to slice through these men and kill both of them. And then the girl ends up running off, and Caden is to be uh, like the interesting thing about Caden is to mention that when Caden is to eventually turn into a werewolf, there's a lot of times that he thinks that he's doing good, but then he also realizes that, well, once the bloodshed starts, it's hard to stop. And so we eventually end up seeing that Caden, with good intentions, still at points in time, he goes a little bit too far. So we eventually have it to where Caden is to eventually go to a bar and find a guy named Wild Joe. And so Wild Joe is to eventually tell Caden that he is not the only one that is a werewolf. And Caden is like, oh, thank God I found somebody else that is like me. And so we end up having it to where Caden is like, dude, like, is there a way to get rid of this? Is there a way to, like, cure myself? Is there a way to, like, besides, like, taking my own life, like, is there a way to, like, be done with this? And while Joe is like, well, if anything, there are other people like you out there, and I can point you into their direction. And we end up having Joe eventually throwing a dart to the dartboard and then vanishing. So we end up having Caden, who ends up going to this town to eventually go to this bar, and we immediately have this bartender who is eventually talking to Caden, and it seems like they're doing this like really goofily dialogue thing where they're trying to figure out one another's names because both of them are actually stumped. Caden doesn't remember his name. Uh, Angelica or Angelina doesn't know her actual name. Like, they're pulling the Bruce Wayne Batman thing where we end up having Selena Kyle. I hope it's Selena Kyle. We end up having we have Basinger or whatever, the first a girl that Bruce Wayne was with in the first Batman movie, where she goes and she's like, excuse me, guy, like, do you know who Bruce Wayne is? Who Bruce Wayne is? Could you point that out to me? And Bruce Wayne is like, well, I'm not sure. Like Bruce Wayne himself says, well, I'm not really sure. Like, I don't know. And then eventually we end up having Bruce Wayne coming back again and eventually saying like, well, hey, yeah, I'm Bruce Wayne. And we end up having that same girl going like, well, are you sure? And Bruce Wayne's like, yeah, I'm sure. Like, I'm sure now. It's like, if anything, you caught me off guard with your good looks and your good looks and all of that. You know what I'm saying? All of that. So we go on and we end up having it to where it seems that uh, that Jason Momoa, who is Connor, is to eventually have seemingly a girl to be thrown to Caden to see what Caden does with this woman. And we end up having it to where really Caden has no real interest because really this girl is just a girl that has probably just been tossed around through any number of people in this town. And so that's why Caden isn't actually interested. He's much more interested in, I guess, real, true, legitimate uh, of a woman actually coming after him, or we end up really having Caden, who's really having an interesting conversation with Angelina, and so that's what's kind of getting him intrigued with this girl rather than the trailer trash that kind of parked her butt right next to Caden. So we end up having it to where we end up finding out that Angelina seems to have a sister that is consistently drunk at her job. We end up having Caden, who's like, well, like, is that girl going to get fired? And we end up having Angelina, who's like, well, considering me and her kind of own this bar, yeah, I don't think that actually is going to happen. And so Caden is like, well, okay. So we go along and eventually have it to where it seems that there is some one of Connor's men that ends up approaching Caden to say that the girl that had just left Caden had touched this girl's butt. And this guy did not like the fact that he did that. And it's like, and Caden never did that whatsoever. So we end up having a fight breaking out between these two characters, and we end up having them being separated, and the fight is stopped. And so we eventually have it to where Caden eventually is to leave because he's like, dude, like, I'm out of here. Like, dude, I don't want any kind of fight with any of these people. I'm out. I don't want to go into a bar fight. I don't want to fight anybody. So we eventually have it to where Caden tries to leave, and so we end up having Caden, who is yet again into the face of this same wolf with this same problem. So we end up having it to where this other werewolf-like character is to showcase that he is a werewolf, and we end up having Caden, who ends up showing that he too is a werewolf, and that he will not put up with his crap. And so we end up having this other werewolf that is of Connor's just running off because he is just I guess really just so scared. Even though in all actuality, uh, like the size portion of these two characters will get Connor interested of why, like his man ran off. So we end up having it to where eventually we end up having this guy who is going by the name John Tollerman. So John Tollerman is to notice that Caden is trying to avoid a fight, trying to do the right thing, and so John is to ask Caden, like, hey, you know what? Like, I heard in the bar there that it seems like you're a guy looking for work. Well, hey, I got a barn, so how about, like, you go and try to help me out? So we end up having it to where uh, we have this whole montage of Caden helping John out on this barn, and so it seems like quite a bit of time has passed, and so we eventually have it to where uh, we eventually have this guy Carter who is to tell Caden who he thinks that Caden actually is. We end up having Carter telling Caden that he could quite possibly be related to Connor, that this actually might be Connor's son that had come back to this town because for some reason or another, Connor had a kid with a pure blood werewolf, and this woman who was the werewolf ended up going and running off with her child. Supposedly, this child ended up dying in childbirth, and so did this woman also die in child. Any number of things probably happened with to where like people are hearing completely different stories and so on and so forth. To where Connor was to assume that he was never going to have a child whatsoever, and so that's why when Kanan comes back here and people have suspicions, Connor is trying to snuff that out to just be like, no, like this Caden guy is not my son because that doesn't make any sense. Why is it that these people would have hid this thing from me for so long? It makes no sense. For 20 years, why would anybody be hiding this from me? So we end up having Carter who ends up in the midst of Connor, and so we end up having eventually Connor, who is to eventually take Carter and have all these werewolves tear him apart because reasonably he is spelling out stories that don't make any real, true, legitimate sense. And so we end up having it to where we have John who is to tell Caden the actual truth. Caden was this legitimate son of Connor because John uh, was a relative of Connor's wife, to where they knew the whole story about what legitimately happened to her kid, and that her kid became born and eventually just vanished and gone into some system to where eventually he ended up getting adopted, and that's where Caden, of course, became Caden. So going on into this, so we end up having John who's telling Caden the truth, and so if anything, we end up having John when Connor arrives. We end up having Connor asking who Caden is to John, and John mentions some story about Caden being some nephew from some family of his. To eventually we end up having Connor who's like, well, that sounds funny. It's like, how is it that this kid is family to you? But John was also at the bar where Connor was and saw that uh, that Caden was not treated like family to John. If anything, uh, he really even barely knew who he actually was. And we end up having John going like, well, you know what? Like, the family resemblance between me and him was just kind of hard to tell. And so, like, I really had to eventually go in later and ask this kid if he was like a family member to me because it was just so long ago since I've seen him. Really, just the bull machine out of John is just working overtime. So we go on and we end up having Connor, who's eventually just to go off and eventually just start to get more and more upset about this Caden character coming into town and like winning over everybody. So we eventually have it to where it seems that um, John is to take Caden to meet a lot of the other werewolves in town. And we end up having eventually Caden to realize that there are some werewolves that are seemingly also part of Caden's family. To where some of them are like, well, hey, I guess we're cousins. Like, hey, isn't that grand? So we end up having to where it seems that since Carter is starting to get out of control, that all these werewolves are thinking that maybe they should go up against Carter, and we end up having like really John and Caden like thinking about this, but all the other rest of the werewolves are like, dude, I don't want anything to do with this. Like, no, like if anything, I want to protect my own hide. I want to protect my own flesh and blood. And like I don't want to get in the middle of this. No. Uh if anything, they're all just naturally assuming to give up Angelina to Connor because Connor all he wants is to eventually uh bed another woman to eventually get another pure blood werewolf so that way he can pass on his legacy because Connor's getting a little older and all really and truly Connor cares about is getting another heir, getting another boy. So we have Angelina who is kind of forced into going to eventually having to be served up for Connor, but we end up having Angelina who is consistently by the side of Caden. We have it to where eventually Angelina is to see Caden kind of doing his farming duties, and eventually we end up having it to where Angelina and Caden are to run through the barn together, and eventually we end up having uh, Angelina ask Caden, well, like, when they're both in the barn together, it's like, well, hey, have you ever been with a woman? Have you ever been with. And we ended up having Caden was like, well, I tried once, but, like, I ended up turning and it just didn't work out. So we end up having Angelina who's like, well, like, hey, how about we do an experiment? So we have both Caden and Angelina both like going at it, and while they're going at it, they're technically turning into werewolves, but it's all perfectly fine. And so we end up having it to where, funny enough, we end up having Angelina who ends up completely and utterly ripping like her whole entire top off to where we eventually end up having it to where after this whole scenario is over, we end up having John yelling for Caden, and we end up having Angelina who ends up showing uh like uh showing up to greet John with just kind of like a shirt kind of wrapped around her chest. And so we end up having Angelina who ends up uh, yelling down to John, like, hey, like, does Clara just so happen to have any kind of like tops or like whatever that I can like use? Because obviously, like, ripping of clothes. And so we end up having John who ends up shouting out to Clara, it's like, hey, Clara, take off your top. Angelina needs it. Like, as a kind of a joke thing, which I thought was funny. So, uh, so we end up going along in this story, and so, uh, reasonably, we end up having it to where eventually that Caden is just going to be going up against Connor. And so, because we eventually have it to be like known eventually by Connor and almost everybody at this point that it seems that this kid really is really and truly Connor's kid. So we eventually have Caden who is going to go up against Connor and his men. And so at first we end up having Caden, who because Caden doesn't want Angelina to end up with Connor, because it just feels like a forced marriage, and it's not actually something that Angelina absolutely wants to do. And so we want, like, Caden is like defending her honor, so that way she can have a choice and not be forced. Plus, also, there seems to be quite a bit of times where it seems that there's some livestock and stuff that goes missing. Um, because like the funny thing is, we ended up having Caden, who ends up kind of looking around in the barn to realize that there had been some sheep that had been desecrated, and John is like, well, hey, like, yeah, like some of the wolves end up coming down here and trying to take some of our livestock. It's okay. It's just human. It's just nature. And John was like, "Oh," or Caden was like, "Oh, thank God. I guess that does make sense." And John was like, "Well, what else do you think that it was?" Just kind of playing to the fact that it's like, "Well, yeah, I know you're a werewolf, and I know that it might have been you, so I'm just coming up with a story to like cover for you," kind of thing. So we end up eventually having it to where, like I said, Caden ends up going after Connor, and so we end up having, of course, Caden, who is to just kind of wound or just kind of barely nick a lot of Connor's men, to where we end up having Connor not having that killer instinct of like it's kill or be killed, and we end up having Connor's men who's like, dude, we're not going to hesitate, we're just going to kill this guy. So we eventually have it to where Caden is to at first try to just take these people down and try to like knock them out, not actually kill them. But eventually, we end up having Caden realize that the numbers game is getting too great. To where eventually, we end up having Caden, who ends up just kind of like jumping off uh, some hillside to eventually land into these trees. Uh, I don't think hillside is the proper word there, but we end up having this like cliff, to where we end up having Caden, who ends up jumping off this cliff to jump into these trees and eventually just kind of smack his way through these trees. It was kind of like a Rambo First Blood kind of moment, where we end up having Stallone, who's like hanging onto the rocks, but then he jumps off the rocks to land into the trees, and then he ends up like breaking a rib or two, making his way down this tree where he's like, "Oh Jesus!" and then he freaking plops onto the ground and he's hurt. Um, Caden's kind of the same thing. So we end up having to where it seems that Caden is all mangled up, and we eventually end up having John and his family going and retrieving Caden, where they end up having to tell him that it's like, dude, you need to have killed all of Connor's men, because like knocking them out will do nothing. So we end up having it to where like basically they're telling him that he can't sit in this bed all day nursing his wounds, uh, that Caden needs to go out and he needs to start running outside, and then he'll feel a lot better, and that he also needs to be able to change into a werewolf because he'll feel a lot better. So we end up having Caden trying to change into a werewolf, and that fails. And so we end up having Angelina dragging Caden out of his bed to go out into the barn to try to run this off. So we end up having, of course, Caden struggling at first to run this off, but then eventually he gets to the point of being able to run and being able to get a really good speed together. And so we end up having Caden, who is now seemingly perfectly fine. So we end up eventually having it to where it seems that Jonathan is going to have to really put up a good defense against these werewolves, because it's like it's either him or them. So we eventually have them come up with a plan, because Connor is coming up with taking Angelina, um, whether she wants to or not, to sleep with Connor. And so we end up having to where Caden is like, that will not, like, I cannot let that happen. So, and plus also, we end up having Angelina who ends up basically getting taken and then drugged to basically do what they say. So we end up having it to where uh, they are to put a pretty decent defense at home, to where Connor is to go out to go for round two to try and stop um, these people uh, from doing what they're doing. I think we have John and Clara who eventually end up also getting taken by Connor's men and eventually being put into some cage, which eventually Angelina helps them get out of, while Caden tries to um, chase off quite a bit of Connor's men. We end up having Caden now who kills first and asks questions later. We end up having Caden who ends up arriving here to slice some guys' throats. And so we end up having Caden who eventually is to run Connor's men off to eventually have uh, Connor meet Caden back at John's barn. So we end up having John, who is eventually prop up with a sniper rifle at this barn, and eventually he is to shoot parts of this barn to where these explosives end up going off, killing some of these werewolves. And so we end up leaving this off to eventually having even Tom blowing up his own barn, so that way he can kill some of these other werewolves off. So eventually it just ends up leaving both Momoa and Caden, or Connor and Caden, to just kind of fight it out. And really, we end up having, of course, where really Connor is just out strengthening Caden. But eventually, it kind of like there's this kind of back and forth thing going on, and eventually, we end up having Connor who ends up mentioning that Caden's mother, he did not take her by force. If anything, they actually really did love one another, and really we do have this kind of almost father and son kind of like moment, which eventually ends up getting ruined. So we have it to where Wild Joe ends up coming back into the fray and is now turning himself into a werewolf to basically say that he had been orchestrating this plan all along to get Caden to come back to face Connor and take him out. Because evidently, we end up having it to where Wild Joe had lost an eye because of Connor, and so Wild Joe wanted to get even with Connor by bringing back Caden, and we end up having Connor who tells Wild Joe, it's like, well, hey, I also took a family member of yours and killed him as well and ate him a week ago. That was Carter. So we end up having Wild Joe who is to eventually just slice the throat open of Connor to kill him off. And so we end up having it to where it seems that it's just left to Caden and Wild Joe. So we end up having it to where it seems that John is also trying to help out take down Wild Joe, but it just doesn't quite seem to work all that well. But and plus also Wild Joe confesses to Caden that he had killed Caden's parents, and Caden is like, what? Like, you were the one who killed my parents. I didn't actually kill them. You made me think that I killed them this entire time, but actually you did. So we ended up having it to where eventually, while Joe and Caden are to fight it out and wrestle it out so far into having Wild Joe, who is just right next to a booby trap that John had set. And so we end up having it to where Caden is kind of making the consensus of like, well, maybe at some point I could have honestly had forgiven Wild Joe for all the stuff that he had done, because it got me to be here. It got me to find my real true family, reunited me with my actual biological father, and ba 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 ba. But you know what, Wild Joe, you did kill my parents. So we end up having Caden, who ends up taking a cigarette, takes a cigar that he had lit, and he ends up dropping it right in front of uh, the bullet bomb that Wild Joe is under, which ends up detonating this bomb, which is to kill Wild Joe off. And so we end up having it to where that ends up killing Wild Joe, and that takes care of every single one of these other werewolves, with the exclusion of both Caden and Angelina to live happily ever after. So we end up deciding to have Caden and Angelina. They had both decided to go on a road trip, and we have it to where Angelina is leaving her bar to her sister. So we end up having both Caden and Angelina deciding to go off road and eventually just have a road trip and make a life out of this. And so we end up having John, who is to say their goodbyes and eventually tell him that there is a huge list of other werewolves that live around these parts. Go and try to find any number of these names that are on this list, and you should find another like-minded person like you that can help you out. So we end up having Caden, who of course is like, man, this is great, and he ends up taking it, and they end up going on the road trip together via motorcycle, and that's just how this movie just ends. So yeah, I think I kind of covered everything. There might have been some things that I just kind of rushed through just because there's not quite enough story, but I actually enjoy the journey of this movie. It's kind of a fun film for a werewolf movie. Plus, there's also kind of much more goofier werewolf movies out there, like a Wolf Cop and like all kind of absurdity of other things. So when looking kind of at this one, like I like the fact that it's a very simple movie, but like I don't know, I just kind of enjoyed the story. I kind of enjoyed the ride. I thought it was fun. So with that said, I think I'm gonna get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.